I begin with a stark and unflinching observation. Wars conclude not when one side desires peace, but when material reality forces an end. Ukraine now finds itself in the final stage of a conflict whose direction was decided long before the opening shot was ever fired. The decisive forces shaping this war were always structural geography, population strength, industrial depth, and the balance of determination. Yet for 2 years, Western officials spoke as though these fundamentals were secondary, as though enough political will or financial commitment could overturn the hard logic of power. That illusion is now deteriorating. The battlefield is exposing what many refuse to acknowledge. In recent months, Russian forces have continued a steady grinding advance across numerous regions. Their gains are not spectacular or rapid, but they are incremental and persistent. And in warfare, incremental pressure often proves more consequential than dramatic offensives. Russian industrial production now surpasses Ukraine's by extraordinary margins, and Moscow's ability to recruit, equip, and train new formations has proven far more resilient than Western projections suggested. In contrast, Ukraine is worn down, demographically strained, materially exhausted, and increasingly dependent on the political moods of foreign governments. This is not a moral critique. It is the unavoidable outcome of confronting a larger, better supplied opponent without an industrial foundation of one's own. What we are observing is the unraveling of the assumptions that underpinned Western strategy in 2022. There was a widespread belief that sanctions would devastate the Russian economy, that military aid would transform the balance on the battlefield, and that Russia lacked the endurance to wage a prolonged conflict. None of these expectations proved accurate. Russia absorbed the economic impact, redirected its production networks, increased military spending, and solidified its command structures. Ukraine fought with remarkable courage, but courage cannot replace ammunition, and hope cannot solve strategic disadvantage. The United States now recognizes that time is no longer favoring Ukraine. Western leaders have watched the front lines come under relentless pressure. They have watched their own weapons stockpiles shrink faster than they can be rebuilt. They have watched their domestic populations grow increasingly weary of a war with no realistic path to triumph. When Washington changes its tone, it does so because the underlying conditions have changed. Power politics eventually forces every government to face the truth. And the truth today is that the military balance has shifted decisively away from Ukraine. This explains the new urgency in American diplomacy. It is not a result of sudden moral clarity or unexpected benevolence. It is driven by the recognition that the battlefield may soon impose an outcome no Western leader can present as a success. The frantic search for a negotiated arrangement is therefore not a signal of strategic certainty, but a symptom of strategic exhaustion and a quiet fear that control over events is slipping out of the hands of those who once imagined themselves in command. From the outset, Western policy toward this war relied on a profound overestimation of its own leverage. The assumption was deceptively straightforward. If the United States and its allies exerted enough economic pressure, delivered sufficient weaponry, and dominated the global narrative, Russia would eventually concede. This belief was not based on an impartial assessment of Russian capability. It emerged from decades of strategic complacency, during which Western power appeared so unmatched that no adversary could sustain resistance. The post-Cold War era taught the West misleading lessons. That economic interdependence could be weaponized at will, that sanctions were always decisive, and that military assistance alone could compensate for structural disadvantages on the ground. This illusion was reinforced by a conviction that Russia's political unity would shatter under strain. Numerous commentators predicted a collapsing currency, mass protests, elite rebellions, or a revolt in the Kremlin. None of these predictions materialized. Instead, Russia adapted. It rerouted trade to Asia, expanded domestic manufacturing, and mobilized society in ways Western analysts had dismissed as unrealistic. Sanctions did not destroy the Russian economy, they restructured it, and in war, the capacity to adapt is often more decisive than initial conditions. The West misjudged not only Russia's resilience, but also its ability to increase military production faster than any NATO country except the United States. The second illusion was moral in nature. The idea that Western intentions were inherently stabilizing while Russian actions stemmed from irrational aggression. This narrative made it politically simple for leaders to claim that the war would be brief, that Western weaponry would grant Ukraine decisive leverage, and that Russia could not endure sustained losses. But wars are not shaped by narratives, and military outcomes do not respond to political rhetoric. Ukraine fought heroically, but Western predictions of Russian collapse proved illusory. Moscow endured losses, adjusted its methods, and shifted its economy into a wartime configuration. Kiev, by contrast, became increasingly dependent on international assistance that arrived slowly, inadequately, or with political constraints attached. The third illusion, and perhaps the most damaging, was the belief that Western leverage would grow with time. In reality, the reverse happened. As the conflict continued, Western stockpiles diminished, internal divisions grew, and the material cost of supporting Ukraine escalated. Russia, meanwhile, expanded its industrial capacity and strengthened ties with non-Western states. Time benefited Moscow, not Washington, yet for nearly 2 years, Western leaders acted as though postponing decisive action would somehow solve their strategic dilemma. It did the opposite. Delay only deferred the moment when they would be forced to confront the situation directly. These mistaken assumptions explain the sudden shift now visible in Washington. When leverage is genuine, states negotiate from strength. When leverage evaporates, they negotiate because they have no choice. The urgency in American diplomacy today is not an expression of confidence. It is an acknowledgement that the window for shaping the end of the conflict is narrowing and perhaps already closed. As the war entered its third year, a troubling dynamic became increasingly apparent. Major political decisions were no longer shaped primarily by coherent national strategy, but by networks of wealthy donors, private interests, and oligarchic actors whose priorities diverged sharply from the broader public good. This phenomenon is not exclusive to Ukraine or the West, but Ukraine became one of the starkest examples of how a nation at war can lose control of its own strategic direction. When resources become scarce, when survival depends on external funding, and when political systems are influenced by private wealth rather than democratic accountability, the logic of the battlefield becomes intertwined with the logic of elite competition. Within Ukraine, corruption scandals surfaced repeatedly throughout the conflict, eroding public faith and exposing the depth of oligarchic influence inside state institutions. These were not trivial issues. They revealed a deep structural problem that long preceded the war: the fusion of money and political authority in a society whose institutions never fully detached themselves from the gravitational pull of private wealth. The war amplified this vulnerability. Western money poured in, often with insufficient oversight. Arms procurement, energy contracts, reconstruction planning, and information operations became arenas where powerful actors sought advantage. A war that required discipline, unity, and centralization instead intensified fragmentation and internal rivalry. But this problem did not exist solely within Ukraine. Across the West, foreign policy increasingly reflected the preferences of a narrow elite class whose affluence insulated them from the consequences of their choices. Political leaders relied on donors. Research institutions relied on wealthy sponsors. Media narratives frequently mirror the interests of corporate backers. In this environment, the war evolved into more than a geopolitical struggle. It became a platform through which elites pursued ideological ambitions, economic gains, and personal prestige. For some, prolonging the conflict was more beneficial than resolving it because the war aligned with their financial incentives or political agendas. This produced a strategic distortion. Decisions were not made based on what could realistically be accomplished militarily, but on what could be defended before domestic audiences and influential networks. The result was a form of strategic capture, policies that seemed unreasonable from a military perspective, such as delaying negotiations, overstating Ukraine's battlefield prospects, or underestimating Russian capabilities, made perfect sense when viewed through the priorities of elite interests. Billionaires, corporate power centers, and influential political patrons carried no direct burden from the human cost of the war. Their reach, however, shaped the stories Western societies absorbed and heavily influenced the choices available to political leadership. When the flow of resources and the direction of policy are steered by actors shielded from consequences, genuine strategic clarity becomes nearly impossible. It is inside this environment that Ukraine's predicament must be interpreted. A nation struggling simply to survive found itself caught in a network of outside interests that frequently overshadowed its own priorities. The tragedy is not that elites exist. Every nation has them. The deeper tragedy is that in moments of crisis, states require disciplined, unified, strategically grounded judgment, yet instead end up navigating a landscape increasingly molded by private influence. By the end of 2024, the strategic environment had tightened to a point where Washington could no longer evade the central question: what outcome was it actually prepared to support and sustain in Ukraine? For almost 2 years, the United States projected a stance of unwavering backing, repeating that Kyiv alone would determine the terms of any settlement. Yet even as officials voiced this line publicly, the underlying reality was evolving. As battlefield pressure grew and Ukrainian capabilities thinned, Washington's role shifted from partner to arbiter, and eventually to something closer to an enforcer. This evolution reached its peak with the ultimatum delivered to President Zelensky, an ultimatum openly described in the reporting and commentary represented in the transcript you provided. The pivotal moment came when Zelensky publicly admitted that Ukraine now faced one of the most difficult periods in its history, describing substantial pressure from the United States and cautioning that Kyiv might soon confront a choice between its dignity and the loss of a crucial ally. His choice of words was revealing. Dignity is what leaders invoke when their leverage is deteriorating. A state that still possesses options does not debate its dignity, it debates strategy. The mere fact that Zelensky articulated the dilemma in such terms showed just how significantly the balance of power had shifted. According to the reporting, Washington's message was blunt. If Kyiv failed to commit to negotiations around the proposed framework, often referred to by analysts as the 28-point plan, the United States was prepared to limit intelligence sharing and potentially reduce arms deliveries. Intelligence, more than any other element, has been the central lifeline preserving Ukraine's military effectiveness. The ultimatum also revealed something about Washington's own strategic nervousness. The pressure campaign was not driven by confidence in an imminent diplomatic breakthrough. It was driven by fear of a rapid breakdown on the battlefield. Reports of Russian advances, including movement near Pikros and across other sectors, had begun circulating with increasing regularity. These operational developments were steadily narrowing the political maneuvering space in Washington. No administration wants to be at the helm during a dramatic failure, and the possibility of Ukrainian defenses collapsing under sustained Russian pressure pushed American policymakers toward accelerated negotiations. Diplomacy in this setting functioned less as an expression of long-range strategic vision and more as an attempt to stop events from racing ahead of political calendars. For Zelensky, The ultimatum represented the moment when agency contracted into constraint. His public remarks stressed trust, dignity, and Ukraine's long-term future. But the cold arithmetic of war is rarely dictated by sentiment. When a nation relies almost entirely on external support to continue its operations, its autonomy becomes conditional by definition. The tragedy was not that the United States exerted pressure. The tragedy was that Washington and Kyiv had spent nearly 2 years claiming such pressure would never materialize. Now, reality had finally imposed itself. Europe entered this war with moral conviction, but without strategic cohesion. It spoke loudly, sanctioned forcefully, and proclaimed steadfast support for Ukraine, yet it lacked the industrial capacity, material depth, and political unity to turn those declarations into lasting influence. As long as Washington led, Europe could afford to look decisive, but once the United States began hinting that its patience, resources, and strategic flexibility were tightening, Europe found itself abruptly exposed. The veneer of unity peeled away, revealing a continent that had never resolved its internal contradictions regarding Russia's security or its own geopolitical purpose. This disorientation is reflected vividly in the episode shown in the transcript you provided, where European leaders, uneasy with Washington's 28-point structure, began drafting what they framed as a fairer alternative peace plan. The attempt revealed more about their insecurity than their strategy. Europe objected to the American plan not because it conceded too much to Russia or offered too little to Ukraine, but because it highlighted Europe's diminishing relevance. For 2 years, Brussels insisted that Europe had rediscovered its unity and moral determination. Yet when the decisive moment arrived, when the terms of war and peace were being shaped, it was Washington, not Europe, that defined the agenda. The impracticality of Europe drafting its own proposal became immediately clear when one asked a simple question: through what channel would it present the plan to Moscow? Nearly all diplomatic communication between Brussels and the Kremlin had been severed. European leaders had publicly condemned Moscow, issued multiple rounds of sanctions, expelled diplomats, and built much of their political posture around the rejection of dialogue. In the process, they effectively handed over all meaningful negotiation pathways to the United States, the only Western power that maintained consistent high-level channels with Russia. The notion that Europe could suddenly craft a meaningful peace initiative ignored the basic truth that diplomacy requires relationships, trust, and communication, precisely the elements Europe had spent 2 years dismantling. Even NATO's Secretary General, though influential in rhetoric, ultimately echoed Washington's stance, a fact underscored in the transcript when Zelensky sought coordination through NATO leadership but remained ultimately constrained by the ultimatum issued from Washington. Europe's effort to pose as an independent mediator was therefore not a demonstration of strength, but a clear indicator of weakness. It was a delayed attempt to reclaim influence after having surrendered it earlier. A continent that once believed it was directing events now discovered it was merely reacting to them. The war exposed the uncomfortable truth that Europe's lofty strategic ambitions were not supported by its resources or its collective resolve. The continent that spent decades championing the supremacy of norms, diplomacy, and rules-based order now found itself unable to shape the most significant security crisis unfolding on its own borders. In this sense, Europe's disorientation was not solely geopolitical. It was civilizational. It exposed the widening separation between Europe's self-conception and its actual power, between its ideals and its capabilities, between what it aspired to be and what it had in reality become. Every conflict reveals the true character of the states involved, not through speeches or symbolic declarations, but through the accumulation of decisions, that determine whether a nation withstands pressure or collapses under it. Russia's behavior throughout the war, its pacing, its messaging, its willingness to endure shocks while maintaining a focus on long-range objectives, demonstrates a strategic culture shaped by generations of insecurity, invasion, and painfully earned survival. Contrary to early Western assumptions, Russia did not enter this conflict expecting a swift or effortless triumph, but it did enter with a precise sense of its essential interests and with a degree of political and societal resilience that many external observers had significantly underestimated.